All right, welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving headfirst into the fascinating, almost domino effect mechanics of the worst economic downturn in modern history to uncover what really happened. It's wild to think about, but people went from the absolute glitz, the jazz music, and the incredible riches of the Roaring Twenties straight into losing their entire life savings and standing in breadlines, all in the span of just a few short years. And it wasn't just an American tragedy either. This spread across the entire globe and ultimately set the stage for World War II. But what exactly caused it all to collapse? Well, let's find out together.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll be looking at 1. The Roaring Twenties boom, 2. The 1929 market crash, 3. The real cause, bank failures, 4. Dust bowls and tariffs, 5. FDR and the New Deal, and finally, number 6, lessons for today's economy. Section 1, the Roaring Twenties boom, an era of mass consumerism. We start our story right after World War I, when returning soldiers and a newly expanded workforce sparked this just incredible economic and cultural boom. During the war, women had entered the workforce in massive numbers for the very first time. So, when the men returned home victorious in 1918, this newly combined labor force, along with a huge cultural shift, birthed the era we all know as the Roaring Twenties. Morals were a bit looser, the parties were definitely bigger, and prohibition, well, that meant very little to this new, liberated generation. Check out this comparison, because Henry Ford completely revolutionized transportation in Detroit. By streamlining production, he dropped the price of a Model T from $780 all the way down to just $290. Suddenly, everyday people could actually afford one. By 1927, the 15 millionth Model T rolled off the moving assembly line. This practically birthed mass consumerism by making things like cars, radios, and washing machines accessible to the masses. This mass production model spread like wildfire, officially kicking off the age of the consumer. Driven by this massive boom and super easy credit, the U.S. stock market saw a staggering six-fold increase between 1921 and 1929. It multiplied by 6. Everyone wanted the latest and greatest products, and banks were practically throwing money at people to buy them on credit. Wall Street became the absolute center of the universe. As everyday folks heard about these unbelievable returns, a massive snowball effect took hold. People were just blindly sinking their entire life savings into stocks, pushing prices up to these irrational levels that were completely disconnected from the actual real-world economy. Now, you've got to understand this concept right here: buying on margin. By 1929, an alarming 40% of U.S. consumer debt was being used strictly for this risky stock speculation. I mean, people were literally going to the bank, asking for a loan for a house or a farm, and then using that cash just to buy stocks. You only had to put down 10 to 40% of the actual stock price, assuming you'd just pay off that massive loan when the stock inevitably soared. It was pure fantasy. Get a load of this quote. It's fascinating and honestly a bit eerie to read this extreme optimism from the newly elected president, Herbert Hoover. He was completely unaware that the economy's fundamentals were already stalling out. By the mid-1920s, global trade was actually slowing down, mostly because Europe was still completely devastated from the war and couldn't afford American goods. But extreme greed just clouded everyone's vision. To Hoover and the general public, a skyrocketing stock market was all the proof they needed that the economy was invincible. Section 2, the 1929 market crash. The bubble bursts. But as we know, that unrealistic fantasy couldn't last forever, and things took a very dark turn in October 1929. The bubble had stretched as far as it possibly could. Catastrophe officially hit on October 24th, a day known as Black Thursday, when the market fell 11%, with a record 12.9 million shares liquidated in pure panic. And then, just days later, came Black Tuesday, dropping another 12%, with 16.4 million shares sold. Millions of shares were just gone, entirely crushing the people who had borrowed money to invest and wiping out life savings instantly. In just 2 weeks, a third of the stock market's entire value vanished into thin air. No way around it, it was a bloodbath. Section 3, the real cause, bank failures beyond the stock market. Now actually, scratch what you might have heard, because this busts a major myth. The stock market crash definitely triggered a recession, sure, but it was actually failing banks that caused the full-blown depression. Many people mistakenly think Wall Street alone destroyed the economy. But the deeper truth is that tons of small, independent U.S. banks had essentially been gambling with their depositors' money, extending way too many bad loans for stock speculation. So when the market crashed, those banks went out of business practically overnight. Because there was absolutely no deposit insurance back then, local bank closures caused mass panic, leading directly to these devastating bank runs. I mean, think about it. If you saw the bank down the street close its doors and all those people lost their money, what would you do? You'd run to your own bank to pull your cash out immediately, even if your bank was perfectly healthy. This meant banks had to suddenly come up with all their customers' money all at once, which is literally impossible. Let's walk through this step-by-step collapse of the Bank of the United States in New York, because it shows exactly how fear alone could destroy a financial institution. It started with a completely false rumor that the bank refused to sell a man's stock. That single rumor caused 25,000 panicked people to crowd the bank. In one single day, $3 million was withdrawn. Unable to handle that kind of run, the bank permanently shut its doors. That one failure alone accounted for a third of the total $550 million in deposits lost during the entire Depression. As one-third of American banks failed, the terrified public started hoarding their cash, which caused the U.S. money supply to plummet by 31%, leading to crippling deflation. Now, deflation means the value of money actually goes up. That sounds great, right? Until you realize it completely stops consumers from spending, it discourages businesses from investing, and it massively increases the burden on anyone holding debt. Wages fell, incomes collapsed, and through it all, the Federal Reserve just kind of stood back and watched it happen without intervening. A deeply, deeply criticized mistake. Section 4. Dust bowls and tariffs. From bad to catastrophic. Instead of jumping in to increase the money supply, the government stood back, and terrible policy choices soon made the crisis truly global. President Hoover largely had no idea how to fix this unraveling situation. And that built into an international disaster. Take a look at this. The protectionist Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 sparked massive international retaliation, causing global trade to completely fall off a cliff by a devastating 66%. Hoover signed this act hoping to protect U.S. farmers from foreign competitors by jacking up tariffs on imports by about 20%. The result? 25 countries immediately retaliated with their own tariffs on American goods. It was an absolute death blow to an already fragile global economy. The human cost here was, frankly, just absolutely staggering. We were talking about 34 million people left without any income at all. Entire industries halted. 9 million savings accounts were entirely wiped out, and over 9,000 banks failed. With unemployment hitting a record 24.9%, disparate families were surviving in breadlines and building these massive shantytowns out of scrap metal and wood, mockingly calling them Hoovervilles after the disgraced president. And then, to make matters infinitely worse, the worst man-made ecological disaster in American history struck the heartland, completely devastating the one-third of Americans still working in agriculture. Years of poor farming practices combined with a severe drought created the Dust Bowl. Massive, choking storms of topsoil swept right across the middle of the United States, destroying farms and completely displacing millions of people who already had literally nothing left to lose. Section 5. FDR and the New Deal. Structural reforms. By 1932, the American public demanded drastic action, leading to the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt and the rollout of his aggressive New Deal programs. FDR moved incredibly fast, as you can see on this timeline. He quickly implemented minimum wages, overtime pay, and a Social Security program. But more importantly for the structural economy, he established the FDIC to provide bank deposit insurance to finally stop those devastating bank runs, and created the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, to force strict reporting and scrutiny on public companies. These reforms slowly restored public confidence, though full economic recovery and unemployment dropping below 10% really only arrived with the vast stimulus required for World War II in 1939. Section 6. Lessons for today's economy, preventing the next collapse. The Great Depression lasted over an agonizing decade, but the economic guardrails it forced us to build, they are still protecting us right now. So, what did we actually learn? Well, economists learned that managing a small, stable amount of inflation is actually healthy because it encourages consumer spending. They also learned that utilizing government stimulus during a downturn is an essential tool to prevent a standard recession from spiraling into a total depression. The federal insurance on your bank account today and the strict reporting rules for the stocks you buy, those are direct, vital legacies of the 1930s collapse. Which brings us to a really important question. Do today's rapid stock market highs and modern financial tech carry those same dangerous parallels of the irrational levels we saw back in 1929? As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with this thought. Human greed, it never changes. Just like all bubbles, an overinflated market always has the same painful ending. So we constantly have to look at our current economic system and ask ourselves if our markets are built on solid fundamentals or if we're just blowing up another fragile bubble. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this crucial piece of history. And hey, please subscribe to the channel for new upcoming explainers so we can continue to decode the forces shaping our world together.